Trouble with training new security forces. The United States has taken on the responsibility training the Afghan army to take over all 34 provinces by December 31st, 2014. There are many problems that may have contributed to prepare the Afghan army to take over military operations. These problems include literacy, corruption, financing, and training. Culturally, sensitivity and trust of each other also haunts the ranks of police and army personnel on both sides. Starting with the most basic issue of literacy, I will show that a takeover in 2014 is unreasonable. One of the main issues is literacy. As many as 86% of the recruits are unable to read and write. As a result, money has to be spent on literacy classes amounting to $88 million per year. Training one Afghan soldier to reach the first grade reading level takes approximately 64 hours. Starting with just the basics, the plan is to raise their reading level of that of a third grader. What does it mean if the U.S. does not take the literacy issue seriously? Soldiers will not be able to do the most basic function in a military that uses sophisticated equipment and requires positions with some technical skill. Reading battle plans, troubleshooting equipment with manuals, and even written and official correspondence will be impossible for a majority of the force. Troops will be unable to read serial numbers on the rifles they are accountable for or read their payment statements. Furthermore, finding and training military personnel to do other jobs such as assisting doctors as medics or administrative functions is nearly impossible. Currently, the focus is on simply recruiting infantry and getting them ready with a minimum level of literacy to perform basic functions. Eventually, however, if the Army is going to stand on its own, this approach will not be sufficient. The United States is going to have to devise a plan that is inclusive of filling positions outside of the infantry combat soldier. Size. The size needed to properly secure the country is enormous. According to the Army Counterinsurgency Field Manual, it takes one counterinsurgent per 50 civilians to defeat an insurgency. Because Afghanistan is a country with 30 million people, that is a total of 600,000 for the Afghan army. The current total is roughly 378,000 in police and army forces. We have already invested almost 10 years to this army building enterprise. Conjuring up more than 200,000 more security force members is an impossible goal by the end of 2014. Besides looking at the size of the army, effectiveness is also an issue. Even if the numbers are there, once a majority of foreign troops withdraw from the country, some of these security force members will surely fall by the wayside. Funding. The Afghan army is costing the United States alone over $1 billion per year. Funding for the army and police, including training and equipment, has fallen primarily on the United States, that has picked up over 95% of the costs. Between 2003 and 2009, $20 billion was spent by the United States. The costs are projected to skyrocket instead of decline, especially in light of the troops additions and funds needed for salaries and more equipment. This is a cost that the Afghan government will not be able to bear on its own. Training. Devising a unified strategy for training the Afghan army and the police have proved difficult. Afghan society and structure have been torn apart by the war and continued violence with the Taliban. The job of the police in any country usually involves patrolling, investigating crimes, and responding to the needs of the citizens, all in an effort to fight crime. Others, like the United States, felt paramilitary force would better suit the needs of the country. The U.S. saw the necessity of the police to battle the drug dealers and the large organized crime syndicates. Additionally, policing activities in a war zone are quite different than a non-combative state. The United States continues to group the Army and the police forces together, with much of the training by private contractors mirroring the training received in the Army. Disputes over the manner in which the training would take place calls for some countries' decrease in participation. The training the police receive can be as long as 8 weeks or as short as 3 depending on the event. When the presidential election was approaching, police were trained in as little as 3 weeks and dispersed to their respective areas fully armed. Even an 8-week program has been criticized for not doing enough to properly train police, especially in areas of ethics and corruption. Training in the Army is filled with its own issues. Among the trainers have been found to a growing trend of referring to the recruits in a derogatory term such as lazy, untrainable, and even the use of racial epithets. Sensitivity training is needed in training these soldiers, most amplified by an incident between a recruit and a trainer. It was a hot day, and an American trainer was shot by a recruit for drinking water in front of the locals during the month of Ramadan. Clearly, communication and attitude are further barriers to effective training between Americans and the Afghans. The 10-week training course does little to address this issue that has potential fatal consequences. After basic training is complete, soldiers are given pay and leave time to be with their families. A percentage of these soldiers do not return. Worse yet, some soldiers desert the Army after receiving training, rest for a little while with their families, and then go and enlist in another area under a different name and start the process all over again. Not only is this a basic example of a flawed system and an unethical behavior, but it is a result in extra funds being put forth to retrain the same individuals over and over again. Corruption. Corruption is rampant among the police and army forces. Recruits have been caught stealing supplies including fuel, equipment, and weapons. Others have been found to be working with the Taliban against the Americans, serving as spies to discover American training practices and techniques. Even those who have signed up for service. Trust. It is very difficult for the Afghans to trust the Americans, just as it is difficult for the Americans to trust the Afghans. Imagining what it does to a soldier to be fired on by an Afghan soldier or by insurgents in an ambush, but none of the Afghans is targeted or hit. Weapons and fuel gone missing. Everyone may look like a suspect. The culture differences make it all the more difficult to communicate. Afghans may have mixed feelings about the Americans. On one end, they are helping to rebuild the country and training forces, but on the other end, they are still foreign invaders with the culture much different from their own. Their true motives for building the country will always be a suspect. The goal set for the Afghan security forces is to take over operations by December 31st, 2014 is unrealistic. Besides the lack of qualified recruits to choose from the members that they are already a part of, the security forces have presented many issues. Lack of quality training, corruption, and rising costs are all issues that must be at the very least controllable before total control is handed over to the Afghans. Until just the basic issues are solved, it is unreasonable to consider any turning over of operations. Thank you.